The winter wind had already taken everything from him, except the little hand holding his own. Ethan Callahan stood alone beneath a fading gray sky, his worn boots sinking into the frozen dirt road outside the small Wyoming town of Red Hollow. The sun was disappearing behind the distant mountains, painting the empty plains with the last weak light of the day. In his arms, his 6-year-old son, Noah, slept against his shoulder, too tired to even complain about the cold. Ethan looked down at the boy and swallowed the pain rising in his throat. For 3 days they had been walking. 3 days since the storm had destroyed what remained of his small ranch. 3 days since the bank had taken the land his father had built with his own hands. 3 days since Ethan packed the only things he could carry and left behind the place where his wife, Clara, had spent her final years. The old ranch house was gone now. The cattle were gone. The future he had promised his son was gone. But Noah was still there. And that was the only reason Ethan kept moving. The wind cut through his thin coat like a knife. His fingers tightened around the small blanket wrapped around his son. "I'm sorry, Noah," he whispered. The boy slowly opened his eyes. "Are we lost, Papa?" Ethan forced a small smile, even though his heart felt heavier than the saddlebags hanging from his shoulder. "No, son, we're just looking for where we're supposed to be." But deep inside, Ethan feared the truth. He had no idea where that place was. The road ahead stretched endlessly across the frozen plains. There were no lights in the distance, no smoke from chimneys, no sound except the lonely cry of the wind moving through the dry grass. Ethan had spent his whole life believing a man could survive anything if he worked hard enough. He had built fences. He had broken wild horses. He had survived storms that buried entire trails. But nothing had prepared him for losing his wife, his home, and his reason to wake up each morning. Now he was just a tired father carrying a child who deserved more than a life of wandering. Then, through the cold darkness, Ethan saw something. A small golden light. At first, he thought exhaustion was playing tricks on him. But then he saw it again. A lantern. Someone was home. A small ranch stood beyond the hill, surrounded by tall wooden fences and a barn with smoke rising from the chimney. It was not a wealthy place, but it was standing strong against the harsh Wyoming winter. Ethan stopped at the edge of the property. He knew what it meant to knock on a stranger's door. He knew the look people gave men like him. A tired cowboy. A single father. A man with nothing but a broken past and a child who needed saving. Still, he walked forward, because a father swallowed his pride when his child was cold. He reached the front porch and gently knocked. For several seconds, there was no answer. Then the door opened. A woman stood there holding a lantern. She looked to be in her early 30s. Her brown hair was tied back, and she wore a simple wool coat over a faded blue dress. Her eyes were cautious but not cruel. Her name was Eleanor Whitaker. And she had learned long ago that the frontier was full of people who looked strong while quietly breaking inside. Her eyes moved from Ethan's tired face to the sleeping child in his arms. "Can I help you?" she asked. Ethan removed his hat. The cold air touched his worn face. "My name is Ethan Callahan." His voice was quiet. "I'm not looking for charity, ma'am." Eleanor noticed the way he said that, like he had repeated those words many times before. "I have a little boy," Ethan continued. "He needs somewhere warm tonight." He looked down at Noah. The boy stirred slightly, his small fingers holding tightly onto his father's coat. "I can work," Ethan said. "I know cattle, I can repair fences, I can fix whatever needs fixing." Eleanor stayed silent. She studied him carefully. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes. She saw the cracked skin on his hands. She saw a man who was not asking because he was lazy. He was asking because he had reached the end of the road. Still, she asked the question she had to ask. "Where is your wife?" Ethan looked down. The silence answered before he did. "She passed away last winter." The words came out slowly. I tried to keep everything together after that. I really did. His voice became softer. But the drought took the cattle, the bank took the ranch, and now. He looked toward the endless darkness behind him. Now I have nowhere left to go. The words hung between them. For a moment, Eleanor saw not a stranger standing on her porch. She saw a man who had carried too much for too long. She looked back at the warm kitchen behind her. A fire was burning. A pot of stew was still on the stove. A small bedroom upstairs sat empty. The house had been quiet for years. Too quiet. After losing her own family, Eleanor had convinced herself that being alone was safer. No one could leave if no one was allowed to come close. But standing there, watching a father hold his child like the boy was the last piece of his broken world. Something inside her changed. She stepped aside. "Bring him inside." Ethan looked up, surprised. "Ma'am." "I said bring him inside," she repeated. Her voice softened. "The boy is freezing." Ethan hesitated. "You don't even know me." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said. "But I know what it looks like when someone needs a door opened." Ethan lowered his eyes. For the first time in months, he felt something he thought he had lost forever. Hope. He stepped into the warm house. And neither of them knew that one simple act of kindness would change 3 lives forever. The warmth of Eleanor Whitaker's ranch house felt almost unreal to Ethan Callahan. After weeks of cold nights, empty roads, and uncertainty, the simple things seemed like treasures. The crackling fire, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of a quiet home. Ethan placed Noah carefully on the old wooden chair near the stove. The little boy barely opened his eyes before falling asleep again. Eleanor watched from across the room. She noticed the way Ethan moved around his son. Every action was careful. Every word was gentle. He was a man who had lost almost everything, but he had never let his son feel the weight of it. "You can put him in the spare room upstairs," Eleanor said. Ethan looked surprised. "I don't want to cause trouble." "You already said that twice," Eleanor replied. A small smile touched her face. "Maybe you should stop worrying about being a burden for one night." Ethan looked down. It had been a long time since someone spoke to him that way. Not with pity. Not with suspicion. Just kindness. He carried Noah upstairs and placed him on the small bed covered with a handmade quilt. The room was simple but warm. A wooden chest sat against the wall. A small window looked over the snowy fields. Noah shifted under the blanket. "Papa." Ethan leaned closer. "I'm here, son. Are we staying?" The question hit him harder than any storm. Ethan looked at his son's tired face. "I don't know yet." Noah closed his eyes. "I like this place." Ethan sat beside him for a moment. So did he. But he was afraid to admit it. Downstairs, Eleanor stood near the kitchen table, staring at an old photograph sitting beside a candle. The picture showed her and her late husband, Thomas. They had dreamed of building a family on that land. But dreams did not always survive the frontier. Thomas had died 3 years earlier while repairing a fence during a terrible storm. After that, Eleanor learned how to do everything herself. She fixed machinery. She managed the cattle. She fought with suppliers who thought a woman could not run a ranch. She became strong because she had no other choice. But strength had come with a price. Her house became quiet. Her evenings became empty. And she had forgotten what it felt like to hear another voice around the dinner table. When Ethan came back downstairs, she placed a bowl of stew in front of him. "You need to eat." Ethan looked at the food. "I can work for it." Eleanor sighed. "You men and your pride." "I'm serious," Ethan said. "I don't expect anything free." She looked at his worn hands. Hands covered in scars from years of hard work. "I believe you." She sat across from him. But tonight you are not working. Tonight you are eating. For the first time in a long while, Ethan allowed himself to accept help. The next morning he woke before sunrise. Old habits never left a ranchman. He quietly walked outside and looked over Eleanor's property. The ranch was beautiful, but it needed care. The north fence was leaning. The barn roof had several weak spots. The cattle needed better shelter before the worst of winter arrived. Ethan knew hard work, and he knew a ranch when he saw one. This place was not failing. It was simply tired. Just like him. When Eleanor stepped outside, she found him already holding a hammer. "What are you doing?" Ethan looked over his shoulder. "Paying my debt." She crossed her arms. "You said you weren't looking for charity." "I'm not." He pointed toward the broken fence. "I'm looking for a chance." Eleanor studied him. "A chance to do what?" Ethan looked across the land. "To prove I still have something worth giving." Those words stayed with her, because she understood them. Over the next several days, Ethan worked from the moment the sun rose until darkness covered the fields. He repaired fences. He strengthened the barn. He fixed the old wagon wheel that had been broken for months. He never complained. He never asked for anything. And slowly the ranch began to change. But something else changed too. The silence inside Eleanor's home disappeared. Noah began following her everywhere. He helped collect eggs. He carried small pieces of wood for the fire. He asked 100 questions every day. Why does the rooster wake everyone up? Why do horses know where they're going? Why does snow disappear when the sun comes out? Eleanor found herself laughing again, a sound she had almost forgotten. One evening, Ethan walked into the kitchen and stopped. Noah was sitting beside Eleanor at the table, showing her a small wooden horse he had carved from a piece of scrap wood. "I made it for you," Noah said. Eleanor smiled. "It's beautiful. It's for when you miss us." The room became quiet. Ethan looked away. Those words carried more meaning than Noah understood. Eleanor gently touched the wooden horse. "You know, Noah, I think this house was missing something." "What?" She looked at him. "Noise." The little boy laughed. Ethan smiled. It was the first real smile Eleanor had seen from him. But happiness on the frontier was always fragile. And trouble was never far away. A few days later, a rider arrived at the ranch. His horse was covered in mud. His coat carried the dust of the road. Eleanor immediately recognized him. It was Calvin Mercer, a wealthy landowner from the nearby valley, a man who had been trying to buy her ranch for over a year. He removed his hat as he approached. "Eleanor's." Her expression hardened. "Calvin." His eyes moved toward Ethan, who was repairing a fence nearby. Then toward Noah playing near the barn. "I see you have company." Eleanor said nothing. Calvin smiled slightly. "I heard you were struggling, thought maybe you finally changed your mind." "My ranch is not for sale." Calvin stepped closer. "You should think carefully. Winter is coming, repairs cost money, feed costs money." He looked toward the fields. One bad season, and this place could disappear. Ethan walked closer. "Seems like she's made her decision." Calvin looked him over. "And who are you?" "Ethan Callahan." Calvin laughed quietly. The man with no ranch telling someone else how to keep theirs. The words were cruel. But Ethan did not react. He had heard worse. Calvin leaned toward Eleanor. "You don't need another problem." Then he looked at Ethan. "And she certainly doesn't need a wandering cowboy with a child." Eleanor stepped forward. "Enough." Her voice was stronger than either man expected. "This is my home." Calvin stared at her, then smiled. For now, he turned his horse around. Before leaving, he looked back. Winter is long, Eleanor. Some people learn the hard way that pride cannot keep a roof standing. After he disappeared down the road, silence returned. But this time it was different. Ethan looked at Eleanor. Who was that man? She stared toward the empty road. Someone who has been waiting for me to fail. And are you going too? Eleanor looked at her ranch. At the fences Ethan had repaired. At Noah laughing near the barn. At the home that had slowly started feeling alive again. No, she whispered. I'm not. But neither of them knew that Calvin Mercer had not come to make an offer. He had come because he already had a plan. A plan that could take everything Eleanor had built. And this time, Ethan would not only have to fight for a ranch. He would have to fight for the first real home he had found in years. The days that followed Calvin Mercer's visit were filled with a strange kind of silence. Not the peaceful silence Eleanor Whitaker had known before. This was the silence of waiting. The kind of silence that came before a storm. Ethan could feel it. He had spent enough years on the frontier to understand that danger did not always arrive with a loud warning. Sometimes it arrived quietly. Sometimes it smiled, shook your hand, and waited for the perfect moment to take everything away. But Ethan had something now that he had never had before. A reason to stay. Every morning, he woke up before sunrise and looked across Eleanor's ranch. The place was no longer just a piece of land. It was a home where Noah laughed, a home where someone waited for him at the dinner table, a home where he no longer felt like a man running from his past. But he also knew the truth. He had no legal claim to this place. No money, no land, no protection, only his word. And on the frontier, a man's word was sometimes the only thing he truly owned. One cold morning, Ethan found Eleanor standing beside the barn, looking over the fields. You're worried, he said. She did not turn around. Am I that easy to read? No. Ethan looked toward the horizon. But I know what it looks like when someone is carrying a heavy load. Eleanor gave a small smile. You always think you can fix everything, don't you? Ethan looked down. I used to think that. And now. He was quiet for a moment. Now I know some things cannot be fixed. His voice softened. But they can be carried. Eleanor looked at him. And for a moment, she saw the man behind the tired eyes. A father. A survivor. A man who had lost his entire world and still chose to be kind. That was what frightened her most. Because she was starting to care. And caring meant having something to lose. Later that afternoon, Ethan rode into town to buy supplies. When he returned, something was wrong. The barn door was open. The cattle were restless. And several fence posts on the east side had been broken. Eleanor ran outside. What happened? Ethan climbed down from his horse and looked at the damage. Someone cut the fence. Her face turned pale. Why would someone do that? Ethan looked toward the empty fields. Because they wanted you to believe this place was falling apart. Eleanor knew immediately. Calvin. Ethan nodded. That night they sat at the kitchen table with lantern light between them. The ranch ledger was open. The numbers were not good. Eleanor had been fighting alone for years. And now Ethan finally understood how much weight she had carried. You should have told me, he said quietly. Told you what? That you were this close to losing everything. Eleanor looked away. I didn't want you to think I needed saving. Ethan shook his head. That's not what partnership means. She looked at him. Then what does it mean? Ethan looked toward the stairs where Noah was sleeping. It means when one person gets tired, the other one carries more. Those words stayed with Eleanor. because nobody had ever said that to her before. The next morning, Ethan rode into town again. But this time he did not go alone. Eleanor came with him. They went straight to the county office. Calvin Mercer was already there. He stood near the desk with a confident smile. "I wondered when you would come." Eleanor placed the papers on the table. "What did you do?" Calvin looked innocent. "I have no idea what you mean." "The damaged fences, the false complaints, the missing cattle reports." Calvin shrugged. "You have no proof." The room became quiet. Then Ethan stepped forward. "I do." Calvin looked at him. Ethan placed a small piece of broken fence wood on the desk. "I found these marks near the east pasture." The county clerk picked it up. "What am I looking at?" Ethan pointed. "The same iron tool marks from the wagon repairs at Mercer's property." Calvin's smile disappeared. Ethan continued. "Someone tried to make it look like the ranch was failing, but they made one mistake." "What mistake?" Eleanor asked. Ethan looked at her. "They forgot that ranch work leaves a trail." The clerk studied the evidence. More questions were asked. More papers were checked. And slowly, Calvin Mercer's plan began to fall apart. He had spent months trying to make Eleanor believe she had no choice. But he had forgotten something important. Eleanor Whitaker was not a weak woman waiting for someone to rescue her. She was a woman who had survived everything the frontier had thrown at her. And now she had someone standing beside her. Weeks passed. The snow began to melt. The ranch survived. The cattle survived. And slowly, the people in Red Hollow began to see the truth. Ethan was not a desperate stranger. He was a hardworking father who had rebuilt fences, protected livestock, and helped save a ranch that was never his to begin with. One evening, as the sun lowered over the fields, Noah ran across the yard holding something in his hands. "Papa." Ethan turned. "What is it, son?" Noah held up a small wooden sign. It was uneven and crooked, but the letters were clear. Callahan and Whitaker Ranch. Ethan stared at it, then looked at Eleanor. She smiled. "I thought it needed a new name." Ethan shook his head. "I don't know what to say." Eleanor walked closer. "Then don't say anything." She looked toward the house. "Just stay." The words reminded Ethan of the night he arrived. The night he had stood at her door with nothing. The night he whispered that he had nowhere left to go. Now he understood. He had not been searching for a place. He had been searching for people who would make a place feel like home. Spring arrived across the Wyoming plains. The grass returned. The rivers ran again. And beneath the same wide sky that had once watched Ethan walk away broken, a new life began. Ethan and Eleanor were married quietly beneath the old cottonwood tree beside the ranch. There were no fancy decorations. No large celebration. Just friends, neighbors, and a little boy who smiled so proudly he could barely stand still. Noah held Eleanor's hand as they stood together. "You're my family now," he said. Eleanor knelt beside him. "We were family the moment you walked through that door." Ethan watched them with tears in his eyes. For years, he believed losing everything meant his life was over. But the frontier had taught him something different. Sometimes losing the life you knew was the only way to find the life you were meant to have. The ranch was still hard. The winters were still cold. The work was still endless. But now, when storms came, no one faced them alone. Because home was never just walls and wood. Home was the person who opened the door. The person who stayed. The person who looked at a broken man and said, "Then come home with me." And that was the greatest gift Ethan Callahan ever received.